Welcome back to our Risky Business podcast. This is podcast number 3, When the Fuel Runs Dry, Planning for the Unthinkable. I'm Emma, and today we're talking about something that may have once sounded simple, a fuel shortage, but is actually one of the clearest examples of why organisations need to plan for the unknown. Fuel is one of those invisible dependencies. We just assume that it'll always be there, generally affordable and always accessible. But what happens when fuel becomes scarce or really expensive? It's not just about stopping cars. It's about freight, food distribution, emergency services, agriculture, public transport, and ultimately the ability to get people to work. A fuel shortage is a cascading event. One disruption triggers 10 more. And it's a perfect case study for why risk management must be proactive and not reactive. To unpack this, I'm joined by Dave O and Dave D from Risky Business. So let's get into it. So first of all, we'll talk about why fuel shortages matter. Because it's not just about filling up the car. Fuel underpins logistics. Emergency services can't function. Our agriculture industry, aviation, construction, so pretty much everything in our everyday life. So Dave O, let's start with the basics. From a risk perspective, why is fuel such a critical dependency?
Yeah, Emma, you touched on this. It's what we call a foundational dependency. So it actually sits beneath every critical system in society. So when fuel's stable, everything feels routine. But when it's disrupted, the effects, as you rightly said, cascade, but they also cascade really, really quickly. So it's not just about transport. Transport's what we see. Fuel enables logistics. So we see trucks, ships and planes, and we're starting to see with planes and the effect now. So if fuel supply tightens, supply chains just don't slow down, they stall entirely. So look, aviation, construction, mining, even backup generators for critical infrastructure like hospitals and data centres, fuel is the common thread that keeps all these systems running. And what makes it particularly critical from a risk standpoint is that it's both centralised and it's time sensitive. So supply chains, as we've seen, particularly in rural areas, many operate on just-in-time deliveries. So that means there's very, very little buffer if anything goes wrong, whether it's geopolitical shock, which we've had, a refinery outage, or a disruption to imports.
Yeah. And it escalates quickly. We tend to think of fuel as a transport issue only, but it's actually a whole of economy issue. And we saw that in COVID, how easily there can be a flow-on effect. If freight slows, supermarket shelves empty, when emergency services can't refuel, response times blow out. As you said, when generators run out, hospitals and other big infrastructures are suddenly exposed. Do you think organisations underestimate how fast a fuel shortage can cascade?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's one of the biggest gaps that we actually see in risk planning. The
Mm.
organisations don't usually underestimate the importance of fuel. They understand that. But what they underestimate, what we've touched on, is the speed and the scale of the cascade when it's actually disrupted. So fuel risk is fairly slow burn problem, but it's extremely rapid in escalation because so many systems are tightly coupled. So once fuel is constrained, those interdependencies start to fail, but they start to fail simultaneously. So it's not just consumer inconvenience, but what happens there is we start seeing the gaps on the shelves and panic buying, or you see people at service stations filling up jerry cans. So what do consumers do? They go and do it as well. So it leads to panic buying. But it's also about pharmaceuticals, medical supply, and critical components. And then, as I said, layer the human behaviour over that, demand spikes, panic buying, and the system comes under really, really big stress. So that's where I think organisations get caught out, assuming that they will have time to adapt. that they'll see the disruption coming and that they'll adjust. And fuel shortages don't behave in that way. They move faster than decision-making cycles. They move faster than resupply planning and faster than coordination mechanisms can keep up. And I think we're seeing that with the federal government at the moment. They're reacting, but they're a week reacting too slow.
Yeah, yeah. And this is where, for organisations, scenario planning becomes really essential. We can't predict the exact trigger. As I said, we saw that with COVID, whether it's geopolitical tension, refinery issues, cyber attacks, or supply chain disruption. But we can plan for the consequences. So I don't think anyone would have foreseen a medical outbreak like COVID to have the same consequences as a fuel shortage could possibly have. So Dave D, when you look at a fuel shortage scenario, what does good forward planning look like?
Yeah, look, Emma, you hit the nail on the head. It's exactly where mature organisations separate themselves from reactive ones. So let's just park to the side the responsibility of federal and state governments for the moment and focus on organisations. However, in my mind, the same principles apply. Good forward planning for a fuel shortage isn't about predicting the cause, it's about understanding the dependencies and the consequences. The starting point is really simple, but often overlooked. What actually stops if fuel stops? And we've spoken about that this morning. Fuel underpins everything. Logistics, staff, mobility is a good one. Generators, as we discussed, critical infrastructure, even supply chains for essential goods. So good planning maps those dependencies clearly and early. From there, I'd say there are three key elements. First, prioritization. Not everything can continue. So you need to pre-agreed decisions about what gets fuel, what gets reduced, and what stops. That's not something you want to be debating in the middle of a crisis. And we're seeing that now, as Dave said. We're a week too late for federal now to have a crisis meeting, cabinet crisis meeting, and talking about fuel czars being put in place. It's just decisions are now going to be made during crisis, and they're never well planned or well thought through. Second thing is continuity strategies. What are your alternatives? Remote working, staggered operations, alternate transport, fuel reserves, supply diversification. These would all need to be thought through in advance. And third, integration with the broader system. Fuel shortages don't happen in isolation. You're dealing with government controls, emergency service priorities, and cross-sector impacts. Organisations need to understand where they sit in that ecosystem, not operate as if they stand alone. So for me, good planning is less about the trigger and much more about prepared decision-making under constraint. Thanks, Emma.
Yeah. And I feel like a lot of organisations still assume that fuel will always be there. And I know we've all done a lot of work on business continuity plans, and Dave D, you recently did one in the hotels industry. And backup generators are always a factor for electricity going out, but I've never seen fuel shortage to run those generators being incorporated into BCP. So, perhaps it's time to review BCPs and start factoring a fuel shortage as part of the generator response. And Dave D, where do you see the biggest blind spots?
Look, the biggest blind spot is exactly that assumption. Fuel will always be there. I still see organisations treating fuel as an unlimited utility. Like electricity or water, it's not finite and contested resources during disruption. There are probably three major blind spots I see consistently. The first is a lack of visibility on dependency. Organisations don't actually understand how deeply fuel is embedded in their organisation. It's not just vehicles, it's contractors, supply chains, third parties, even staff commuting. The second is no prioritisation framework, which I spoke about. When shortages hit, everything suddenly becomes critical. And if everything is critical, nothing is. Without predefined priorities, decision-making becomes slow, reactive, and often inconsistent. And the third, and probably the most concerning, is overconfidence in business as usual systems. People assume supply chains will flex, suppliers will deliver, or government will step in quickly. But in widespread disruptions, everyone is drawing from the same limited pool. I'd also add a broader point. Many organisations plan for events, but not for constraints. A fuel shortage is a constraint-driven crisis. It's not about what's happening. It's about what you can no longer do. And unless organisations start planning for operations under limitations rather than just disruption, they'll continue to be caught off guard. Although we are talking about fuel today, the same applies for water, electricity, gas, internet connectivity, and whatever drives or supports your organisation.
Absolutely. And this is a textbook example of why risk management can't just rely on historical patterns. We need to plan for low probability, high impact events that disrupt multiple systems at once, whatever the causation may be. You spoke about workforce mobility and remote work, which I think is a really good example of, again, how things from COVID also apply to fuel shortages. So, talking about people, if fuel becomes scarce or, let's say, ridiculously expensive overnight, workforce mobility becomes one of the first pain points because staff just simply can't get to work. So, Davo, what does this mean for organisations? And should remote work now be considered as a resilience strategy and not just a COVID strategy in planning phases?
Yeah, absolutely. It should. I'd actually go a step further and say that organisations that don't treat workforce mobility as a resilience issue are actually carrying a blind spot, which Dave was talking about in their risk profile. Fuel security hits people first, and it hits them really, really fast. As we said, it escalates quickly. So if the staff can't afford to travel or physically can't get access to fuel, your workforce availability drops almost immediately. Now, some areas can do work from home, but a number of areas, i.e. mining, you have to be physically on site. And with a lot of the infrastructure and critical infrastructure we have, you won't have this capacity that you can quickly use what's referred to as a surge capacity because they simply can't get into the workplace. So it means for organisations that workforce continuity is no longer about numbers and skills. It's about actually access, them being able to physically get to where they need to be when they need to be there. So this is where the remote shifts. They go from being a convenience or, as you rightly said, a COVID era adaptation into a genuine resilience strategy. It reduces dependency on transport systems. And you've heard them already start talking, though, about not using vehicles to drive into the city or into work when you can, use transport systems. And I agree with that because it decouples your organisation from fuel availability and it gives you flexibility when physical movement is constrained. But you've also got to look, it's not a silver bullet. Not every role can be done remotely. Some sectors, healthcare, that's adapted a lot, but it hasn't adapted completely. Emergency services will be very hard hit, as will logistics and critical infrastructure. So organisations need to think more broadly, again, about their workforce design. And the key point is fuel risk translates directly into a workforce risk. And if your workforce can't mobilise, then your organisation can't function, no matter how strong your plan looks on paper. So I agree. Then you start working with what Dave said is what is critical, what can you do without? And during a crisis, as Dave rightly said, everything is viewed as critical when in fact it's not.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's important you mentioned mining as an example. I think when you live in the Sydney metro area, you sort of forget sometimes, unfortunately, about our people in the rural and regional areas, and they're actually hit the hardest because if you're in a metro area, you might have trains or buses as a fallback. But in country areas, if you can't drive, you simply can't get to work. And we take it for granted in metro, one petrol station might run out of petrol, but we just go to the next one. Again, rural areas don't have the convenience of that. And that has massive implications for essential services like agriculture and supply chains that then does affect the metro. So I think we all need to turn our mind to this being a broader problem. So we'll talk about public transport and infrastructure impacts, and it's quite timely for us at Risky Business because we're doing a project with Sydney Trains at the moment. The reality is if people can't drive, public transport becomes the pressure valve, but it's actually not designed for sudden surges. If overnight it becomes an issue, fuel prices just spike out of control where people just can't fill their cars overnight, trains and buses will be overloaded overnight. So Dave D, what should public transport operators be planning for right now?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? I know a lot of people at the moment are just reverting to that, and but in these types of instances, public transport becomes the shock absorber in a fuel disruption, whether it's ready or not. That's the important thing. We've seen reporting just this week suggesting public transport demand spikes of around 10 to 20%, and that's exactly the kind of surge most systems aren't designed for. The challenge is that most networks are designed for predictable peaks, which is your morning and afternoon commuter flows, not system-wide surges driven by external pressure, just like fuel shortage. So what does this mean for operators? What should these guys be planning for right now? Let's break it into a couple of key areas. Firstly, demand surge modeling. Operators need to understand what overnight overload actually looks like. What happens if patrons increase by 20, 40, and even 60%? What does the network fail first? Platforms, rolling stock, staffing, or signaling? Because the failure point is rarely where people expect. Secondly, operational elasticity. What I mean by that is how quickly can you scale? Can you extend services, reallocate fleet, adjust timetables, or prioritize key corridors? And importantly, do you have the workforce available to support that? Because in many cases, staff are impacted by the same fuel constraints as the public, as we've discussed. Third, crowd management and safety. So we already see now in real time when train disruptions occur, the overflow that occurs on platforms. So we've got to start thinking about crowd management and safety. Overloading isn't just an inconvenience, it's a safety risk. Platforms, interchanges, and stations become pressure points very quickly. So planning needs to be included control access, queuing strategies, and clear escalation triggers before safety thresholds are breached. Fourthly, communication and expectation management, and this is really key because I watched an article, a news clip last night, and there was nothing to do with expectation management. You have to get ahead of the public narrative. If people turn up expecting a normal service, the system will fail faster. So clear messaging around capacity, delays, and alternative options become critical. But I'd add one more point. Public transport operators shouldn't be planning this in isolation. This is a whole of system issue. It requires coordination with government, emergency management, and critical infrastructure sectors to prioritise movement, whether that's essential workers, freight, or emergency services. Because when fuel disruption hits, it's not just a transport problem, it's a social movement problem. And the organisation that plan for that system-wide impact, not just their own network, are the ones that will hold up under pressure. Thanks, Anne.
Yeah. And this is where interdependencies really show themselves, because if trains and buses are overloaded, safety does become an issue. If they need more services, they need more fuel. If they need more fuel, they're competing with emergency services and freight. It becomes a whole system coordination challenge. So let's zoom out a little bit. Some industries simply cannot function without fuel, as we've spoken about already: agriculture, freight, emergency services, construction, mining. These sectors don't have the luxury of just work from home. So Dave O, which industries do you think are most exposed, and what should they be doing today?
Look, some sectors are very, what we'd call, I guess, fuel intensive and fuel dependent. And for them, there's no easy solution. If fuel availability drops, their operations don't degrade gracefully, they just stop. So the most exposed industries tend to share characteristics, which is high resilience on heavy machinery, continuous operations to keep it going, and limited alternatives to those liquid fuels. So, freight and logistics jump right to the top. They have to. They're the backbone of the supply chain, but they're also highlight sensitive to fuel price and availability. So even small disruptive ripples, I'd call them, quickly across the whole of the economy. Agriculture, if you look at the one this morning, the big one with Easter coming up, is seafood. And simply the ability of these boats, which are diesel driven, to be able to go out offshore, or the ones that are coming down from Queensland, they do a lap down to Victoria and then back up. They're not able to get their fuel supplies. So therefore, for Easter, there's going to be a shortage on seafood. Again, the minute you start impacting the general consumer, the more the crisis escalates really, really quickly. So look, you've got seasonal stuff, time critical, mechanised. That's for agriculture at the moment. So they're dependent, they can't wait. So if you've got industries like, I guess, construction, mining and aviation, they all rely heavily on diesel. We've seen the prices go up. So, what all industries now need to do is start treating fuel as a strategic risk, not just an operational cost. So they have to think strategically, not just this is what we're paying. So it's elevating it in the risk register. It's in business continuity plans, and it's about executive decision making. And they should be looking at assured access. So that's from multiple sources, multiple agreements, diversified suppliers, on-site storage we've very much gone away from, recognising that the just-in-time supply is in fact a vulnerability itself, and scenario planning. Dave touched on it. What if what if the availability drops 20%? What if it drops 40% or more? What gets prioritised? What stops? And what are the second and the third order of impacts that go through that?
Yeah, absolutely. And Dave D, do you think this is a wake-up call for diversification? Perhaps considerations like electric fleets, rail freight, localised supply chains?
Yeah, 100%, Emma. I think it is a wake-up call, and it's probably one that's been coming for a fair while.
Mm.
I would frame it slightly differently, though. This isn't just about diversification. It's about resilience through optionality. As Dave and I have discussed, fuel has always been a single point of failure for a lot of sectors. What's changing now is the realization that the dependency can be disrupted quickly and at scale. So yes, electric fleets, rail, freight, localized supply chains, they're all part of the solution. But as Dave said before, there are no silver bullets and they don't happen overnight. What organisations should be doing today is asking a more practical question. What are our viable alternatives under constraint? If fuel becomes limited, what can we realistically shift? Can freight move to rail? Can last minute delivery be decentralised? Can parts of the workplace operate differently? Can we reduce demand rather than just replace supply? Because diversification only works if it's operationally ready, not just strategically inspirational. The other piece is time. In a crisis, you don't build new capacity. You rely on what you've already established. So if organisations are thinking about electrification or supply chain localisation, they need to start it now, not when the disruption hits. And we're in the middle of that now, so it's probably a little bit too late for some of that. But, as I said, this can happen again. And I'd also say this isn't just a private sector issue. There's a strong role for government and cross-sector coordination here, particularly around infrastructure investment, policy settings, and prioritisation during shortages. So yes, it's a wake-up call, but more importantly, it's a shift in mindset from efficiency and optimization to resilience, redundancy, and adaptability. And the organisation that embrace that shift early will be far better positioned when, not if, these disruptions continue to occur.
Yeah. Because if we actually ran out of fuel or if it became ridiculously expensive, we'd see a fundamental reshaping of how society actually functions. And we have seen that happen before. Schools might close, tourism collapses, food distribution slows, hospitals rely on generators, councils struggle to run waste services. It's a domino effect. And I know there'd be a lot of parents out there that are scarred from homeschooling that this, may really affect them. So the part I love, lessons learnt. Fuel shortage is a perfect example of why organisations need to think ahead, understand the dependencies and build resilience before a crisis. So I'll throw to both of you here. What does this teach us about the future of risk management?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first, Dave. Look,
Right.
For yours.
what it really highlights is what Dave and I have been talking about the whole time is that the future of risk management, it's all about dependencies now, interdependencies and systems thinking, because for a long time organisations have managed risk, I guess, in fairly discrete silos. So, supply chains over there, workforce risk is over there, and operational risk is somewhere else. So we got to change the way we're thinking about it. So we move from risk lists to risk systems. It's not enough to simply identify risk disruption as a line item, and that's where it stays. It also reinforces the importance of anticipation over reaction. This is fast moving disruptions like fuel shortages. You don't have the luxury of time. And the last thing you want to be doing is making decisions under crisis. And I think another key lesson, think in terms of continuity of function, not just continuity of operations. So look, in so many ways, I think you said it earlier, Em, the fuel risk is a perfect case study as to where risk management is heading into the future. It's more integrated, more about looking forward, and much more focused on how complex systems behave under stress.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think I'd agree with everything Dave said there, Emma. It's we see it in our world. We do the what ifs, and Dave, you'd agree with me. We do the what ifs, and we always get the pushback. That'll never happen. That can't happen to us, or will never happen. But time and time again, we see these things. And if we'd had this conversation a month ago before, Trump invaded Venezuela, then we probably wouldn't have been having this conversation at all. But the reality is, we're here now, and fuel shortages at our doorstep. And for those in the audience who are old enough, we're going back to fuel shortages back in the day where you'd have to do even an odd number plates to get fuel, and the lineups going for kilometres to get fuel. We're dead set heading that way, and the future of risk management is really just shifting, first from siloed risks to interconnected risk systems, from plans to decision-making frameworks, and from efficiency to resilience. For years, organisations have optimised for lean operations, just-in-time supply, as Dave said, minimal redundancy, but those efficiencies often remove the very buffers you need in crisis. And we're looking at that now with our minimum fuel storages, federally. We're supposed to have 90 days, and I don't know if I can believe it or not, but the reports say we only had 35 days. So we haven't even adapted at a federal level. And the cascading effect of this risk is, as we've discussed today. So resilience is about deliberately building in slack, flexibility and options, and even if it looks inefficient on paper. Risk management is no longer a compliance function, it's a strategic leadership capability. Because an environment of constant disruption, the organisations that succeed won't be the ones that avoid risk. They'll be the ones that are best prepared to absorb, adapt, and continue operating when things don't go to plan.
Absolutely.
I did laugh, though. The one thing that comes out of the woodwork is your left field triggers when people communicate really well when there's an opportunity. And I saw a really big sign up the road at the petrol station the other day which had, "Don't panic, buy an e-bike." And I went, there's somebody, a local business, who has seen the opportunity and goes, beautiful, that's what I want to do. They're forward thinking, looking, here's my opportunity, this is what I'm going to do. That's what big corporations should be doing.
Yeah, but then that comes with a whole heap of different issues.
100%, 100%. It's just seeing the funny side of it, that somebody actually sees an opportunity in a time of crisis.
Yeah. Wow. So I think the big takeaway is this: risk management isn't about predicting the exact event. It's about understanding your vulnerabilities and your ability to adapt when the unexpected happens. So fuel shortages, cyber attacks, supply chain failures, COVID, they're all reminders that resilience is built before the crisis and not during it. So that's all for today's episode from Risky Business. A huge thank you to Dave O and Dave D for unpacking this with me. If today's conversation made you rethink your organisation's dependencies, that's exactly the point. Fuel shortages aren't just about petrol prices. They're a systems-level disruption that touches every part of society. I'm Emma from Risky Business, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you. Thanks, Daves.